Friday. And if anybody wants any additional things in the packet, I would appreciate it if you would send us an email or give us a simple phone call. We'll be more than happy to put it in the packet instead of doing it this way. We'll go ahead and start the work session again. You want to bring it back up to the table with our additional information. Dave.
Mr. Mayor, I had some questions stemming from the correspondence we received, specifically Mr. Benedetto, page 2. He articulates there several references to our growth policy, where it says that we will not transfer property until there's been studies that are done and 2 or 3 things there. James, or do we know what of those things outlined in the growth policy we have done? Have we had parks look at it? Have we had those outside inputs that our growth policy calls for done?
No, I've talked to a member of the Parks Board about it, just to tell them what was going on there. Part of the reason this situation is a little different is because there's a structure there. But the Parks Board and the Planning Board through the growth policy have made clear that they want to protect our property when possible to Rock Creek, whether it's right away or city-owned land, but that they not only want to preserve that, they would like to increase it in time.
Would this property be a good candidate for a pocket park that is referred to in this if it does not have public access to the creek?
The property is very sloped. It could be done potentially. It's not one of the first places we do it. About 3 or 4 years ago, when the Parks Board still had some money, they were in the initial stages of trying to. They weren't being called pocket parks because they're public rights of way, and there was no push at that time to make them parks technically. But since it was publicly owned land, we had a lot of discussions about clearing some spots at the end of our right of ways that meet Rock Creek, and that we would maybe put a bench there, maybe put a fishing sign up off of Broadway, just to let people know, hey, you can access the creek from here. And 12th Street was identified as the best street to do that, at least initially, because there isn't, it's a pretty steady, slow slope to it, whereas 12th Street, there's kind of a cliff right behind the garage. So it doesn't mean it can't be done, but it wasn't one of the first ones identified.
Is it publicly owned property that is up at the creek?
So we'd have to have it surveyed to know exactly. So there's a little triangle of that portion of Daly Avenue that reaches most of 12th to a little over half of 12th Street. But there would be it looks like on that the south side, a little bit of the area where it looks like there is right away too.
A little bit.
A little bit, not
Like
as much.
what's the footage?
I'm not sure. We'd have to have it surveyed, because when you can look at the plat maps and get a general idea, but without a survey, don't know for sure.
So probably not a good candidate for the pocket parks that they're referred to.
I think it's not impossible. It's not one of the easiest places to do it though. You can see on this map that was in the application in the packet last time, the Daly goes to about the midway point of 12th Street. Here's 12th, that's right in the middle. So that the portion we are not abandoning does appear to go all the way to the creek, the right way does.
And that triangle, there's a question about that
Yeah.
is not resolved. That the property owner says he has title to that property.
And I paid taxes on it for 41 years. I have this survey and there's a pin right out there. They can take you to the pin where it is. I had the survey done 39 years ago. So there, and it's an 8-foot drop to the creek. Since I have that sliver of land, if somebody was trying to access, I'd put a fence up. Because I'm not gonna be liable for somebody tumbling down. There's no way to get there. I mean, I literally have to hang off a rope to go down and pick the garbage up every time I'm here, because invariably the bearers are spreading the garbage out of the garbage cans, and they bring it to my yard to go through it. So you're still gonna have the other half of 12th Street. And that half starts to mellow out, and there's actually some old concrete slabs in that half. And there's case law specifically on point because the city has done nothing to this right of way. There's 25-foot cottonwood and other trees in the middle of it. But there's a case on the point that says the city can just bring a bulldozer in if they need to continue the egress. But you can't continue the egress because there's a strip of private land there that I own.
All right.
And that's really the point, is that I own the fee to the middle of 12th Street. The fee is subject to the conditional use. And the conditional uses aren't for a park. That's not described in the conditional use that the title is subject to. The conditional use is for egress, ingress, and the provision of utilities. You've abandoned the water line that is now mine. So I have a water line that instead of being what would have been a 15-foot dig, we had to dig 40 feet, would have to dig 40 feet to the new curb stop. The new curb stop is out along the alley line, but it's still 12 feet in to 12th Street. And that's why when the city attorney said the curb stop's on my land, well, if we break it down, the fee is mine. The fee is subject to the conditional use as long as you don't abandon it. But both Bruce and Jim Bushnell, when I showed them this condition, said, oh, we abandoned that curb stop, so you have to fix it to the new curb stop, which means that the 22 and a half feet of old line that was at least 100 years old, then became my responsibility. That's abandoned. And what that means is that you've given up the conditional use. And there's case law specifically on point. I can recite that to you. There's a new case. And like I said in my memo, I just like to get it taken care of. I mean, for 41 years, James, Mr. Caniglia said he spent 3 hours. I spent 15 hours going through your files over the last 40 years. And I can tell you that there are building permits, and 34 years ago, I found the approval to build the garage, but it was at a different time than when I was told when I purchased the property, the garage was built. And when I purchased the property, I did it on a contractor deed. The title insurance wasn't that great, and the realtor told me that the street had been abandoned.
So if you wanna have things on record, you can wait until the public hearing. But if you
Okay.
wanna continue on, you.
No, I thought you wanted to hear from me. I can wait till the,
I saw referenced in the materials that there was found to be a permit of the garage. There's a couple things that were referenced that also said recent searches have not found in this record. Are there copies of it from previous past searches that could be copied and included in this, or is it just somebody's recollection?
it's my recollection of finding it with Ray Jerkovich's wife when she was the secretary, but you've got 7 or 8 books in there. And this last time, I was here in August, and I spent 5 hours standing there looking through your records. And what I actually found was the building permit for the little porch that would walk through to get into the house. So the building permits and approvals do exist in there. I just couldn't find it this time, but, it was in 1949, and I was told that the garage was built in 53 when I bought it. Barbara Marshall said her father built it, and she was the realtor who sold it to me.
I'm trying to figure out if there's a garage or a permit there. My gut is, if that's relevant, if that's a relevant part of this when it's distilled down, I would think we ought to wait until we can find that, because in the absence of having some indication of it, officially it doesn't exist, in my mind.
Well, officially, you've abandoned the street.
So, and that, there's a second part of that conversation that I'm a little confused on. So I agree with the comments that were relayed on that the rules and regulations as it worked are, and I'm not gonna use property lines as a reference, because we've had a couple cases that have come up, and what it boils down to is property lines and who owns and who doesn't own the actual land fee simple is not relevant to whether it's the city's burden or the property owner's burden to repair a leak. It is dependent on, and I'm gonna just use the term upstream or downstream of the curb main. Now, that assumes, through all of that discussion, all that language, that there's only one curb stop.
Exactly.
So when there's two curb stops, it's like, okay, so which one? Because my understanding is, if it was deemed that the second curb stop was still a curb stop, then the repair should have been borne by the city, if I'm understanding the conversations correctly.
I don't know that that's what we're discussing here. We're discussing whether we're gonna abandon 12th or not.
Okay, that's fair. I will be looking forward to the public comment section of the meeting to find out if there's a persuasive argument about how this, and granted, it's a very teeny, as I'm reading it, as I'm looking at it, it's a really tiny silver triangle of land. Do we know what the dimensions of that entire piece of property are? I mean, I'm guessing like on the wide spot, it's 4 to 8 feet wide, and then it goes into a triangle point that's 12 feet away, but that's just total guessing based on.
It's 30 feet long.
Okay, so that's a 30 feet long, so it's probably 8 to 10 feet at its widest spot that then goes to a triangle. So we're talking about, I'm not gonna do public math, we're talking very little square footage.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's less than 300. I mean, it's probably 150 to 200 square
I was gonna
feet.
say 150, I think, yeah.
And you're trying to get access to this triangle?
Well, the concerns as I have understood them is, are we abandoning what our growth policy says? Because our growth policy does use words like shall, which has a very purposeful meaning, legal definition, and it prescribes steps that we're going to do. And it talks about the reasoning behind all of those is to protect public lands, access, riparian corridors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm trying to figure out if that still holds any validity, or if that sways my vote when we're talking about something I couldn't park my car in. So I will be looking forward to that in the public hearing part of the discussion.
More comments at the table? Move on to number 2, ordinance 951, amending zoning regulations to reduce parking requirements at bed and breakfast discussion. James, want to give us a little background on that?
Sure. The request is to reduce the parking requirements for bed and breakfasts. The zoning currently requires 2 parking spots for the owner or manager of the property, and then 1 for every room. We had some discussions about the planning board, and the planning board felt that that's a onerous requirement, that many of these lots can't do that. Our bed and breakfasts are allowed in all of our residential districts. And most lots simply do not have the ability to provide that kind of parking. And furthermore, we've got stormwater issues, we require landscaping for conditional uses, and when we require more parking, we're tending to require people to create more impermeable surface, increasing stormwater runoff, reducing landscaping by providing paving. So the request, which was agreed upon by the planning board, is to reduce those parking requirements to a half of a parking spot for every room. Not literally half, but one spot for every two parking spot, or every two rooms rented. So that was the request made by Heather Plant of Seymour, and this came about in particular because of the Sunrise House, that somebody's looking to purchase that. They do have some parking off of the alley. They were approved for a conditional use. Then it was discovered that there was issues with a French drain in that parking area that was gonna really complicate things. And nobody really wanted to see them put in a driveway off of Villard or off of 8th Street onto that property, and really damage the aesthetics of the property, is what we would require. Now, in this particular case, that house, for example, is on a corner lot, and there's a lot of on-street parking available, so there's not an issue there. But one thing to keep in mind is we have to apply the parking requirements the same to everybody. So if it's in the middle of a block, they have the same requirements. They may not have much off-street parking, or they might not have much on-street parking if they're in the middle of the block. So the bed and breakfast in general, I don't know that they're really going to be something we'll see a lot of. I don't know. So many people are doing the short-term rentals now where there's nobody at the buildings full time. Where we had the discussions on that in the planning board as well about requiring parking for bed and breakfast or short-term rentals, whether or not they are renting out multiple rooms. So right now you actually can do a short-term rental, rent out multiple rooms to different people, and there's no parking requirement. There have been a couple people from the planning board that have said they would like to discuss that further when we open our zoning up again, but at this time there are no requirements at all there. And so I think the reducing the parking requirements for the bed and breakfast makes sense to be more in sync with what we're requiring elsewhere. The planning board did vote to approve that on the 6th amendment vote.
Open up for discussion at the table, Dave.
I have a question as far as some ambiguity that need to get cleared up, and you did it as you were discussing it as well. The ordinance itself refers to rented rooms, or rooms rented, and the staff report just refers to per room. Now, this particular planning meeting I was unable to attend, but I know we've got 3 lines in the room that were there. Do you recall what is the intent? And so let me give you an example. Is the room that the keepers are in, does that count toward the room count? Or is it only, if I have a 5-bedroom house and I'm renting 3 rooms, is it 3 rooms or 5 rooms that I'm doing the math based off of?
That's a good question and a great thing to get clarified, but as I understand it, that we would just have 1 parking spot for rented rooms for every 2 rented rooms. So if there's 4 rented rooms, they have to have 2 parking spots. And then if the owner has another room that they're living in, that they would only need 2.
Okay, so the verbiage that's in the ordinance, to your recollection, matches the intent of the planning board?
Yeah, but I think that's a good thing to clarify in the zoning a little bit better, reading the language.
And then before we dig too far into that, so you can look at it at the same time, it also references that there are 2 parking spaces for the owner manager, and as I read this, that requirement would be dropped completely altogether.
Correct.
So that was the intent.
That was the intent.
Okay, so it's just the question is, if I've got 6 rooms and I rent 4, do I need 2 spots or do I need 3 spots?
2 is how I interpreted it.
So rented rooms.
Heather, got something to add?
It's 0.5 space per room,
Per-
period.
Per room, not
Per-
per rented room?
No, per bedroom. So if you have in this situation, a 7-bedroom property, then you would round up and you would need 4 parking spaces versus 3.5.
Even if I only rented 2 rooms and for the intent of bed and breakfast.
As a B&B, the whole property would be classified as a B&B, so you would need 0.5 per bedroom.
Okay, but this says per rented room. I mean, that's the question that Dave had. Are we going by per available room for rental, or are we going by per those that are rented, correct?
Well, I'm gonna use really big numbers to make it clear, and I'll stick with 6 because it seems, so I have a 6-bedroom house. It is my goal and intent to rent 2 of those rooms only. To me, the way the ordinance is written, I have to have 1/2 a spot for each of those 2 rooms. So I need to have 1 spot off-street in order to rent 2 rooms. If instead, I'm basing it on how many rooms there are in the house, how many bedrooms, whether or not they're gonna be used for storage, or whether they're going to be used for rentals, then I would need to have 3 off-street parking spots. And to me, the first example in the rented room kind of actually makes more sense, because that way you could have a bed and breakfast, and how much off-street parking dictates how many rooms you can rent out, which is kind of the function.
This doesn't specify off-street. This, actually, the petition just says parking.
Well, our zoning regulations, whenever it's talking about parking, it's talking about off-street.
So,
So when you see this piece of paper, the section 4.4.22 specific uses, bed and breakfast, and the language that was proposed, 1/2 a parking spot for each room rented to guests shall be provided on site. Other sections in the zoning clarify that that is indeed off-street parking.
I think for
So
clarity,
it
we
doesn't really
should,
matter that it's on a corner if you're requiring off-street.
Correct.
I would propose that we amend this to include off-street in front of the word parking in the whereas, or in the therefore. That it's entitled to change off-street parking requirements for bed and breakfast, because that is what we're actually talking about changing.
Okay.
Yes?
That's fine. I do think we have a lot of places in our zoning where we're talking about parking requirements, and it does not say that. Because there's other sections that clarify that, but that's an easy addition.
To the 2 folks that were in that planning board meeting, is there a concern if we stick with the rented room as written?
I'm fine with that. Totally fine with that.
Jeff, your thoughts or input? You were there, I wasn't.
Yeah,
I think we probably need.
I
to
think,
have
I think,
part
I
of
mean,
the
that
public
could,
hearing so
that
it's
could,
on record.
I guess what concerns me about that is that I think this would come before the planning board as a conditional use. So as part of that conditional use, they would have to specify the number of rooms that are gonna be rented.
Do you mind if we wait and have that part of the conversation during the public part of the meeting, Jeff, so it can't be part of the record? Thank you. My bad for asking at this point.
And the specific language that is being proposed for the zoning regulations, it does end by saying shall be provided on site. So that on site does mean off street.
And where is that in what I'm looking at?
This section is the proposed language for the zoning. At the very top, it says 4.4.22 specific uses, bed and breakfast.
I don't believe I have that. It doesn't sound familiar to me.
It should be, I got mine straight out of my
Yeah,
packet.
looks like this. It's for the blue. Number 6 is in
It's
blue.
between the two color patches. Page 4.
I like to reorganize these for easy reference, so let me see if I can find it.
Maybe we could amend the ordinance to read, make that clear.
What I don't wanna do is, cause when we do an ordinance, it's gonna override another section of code, so I don't wanna inadvertently remove the part that says that, is my concern.
Absolutely.
I know I had something with color there. No. Don't
I have
go
a
there.
silly question.
Oh, mine's not
Does a
color.
bed and breakfast and a short-term vacation rental, are those one and the same, or are those different?
They have different definitions.
They have
for-
different definitions? Do we have any parking requirements for a short-term vacation rental?
No, that's what I was saying, to make reducing, the requirements for it will make it more in sync with the, short-term rental. Lack of parking requirements.
Can you just call yours a short-term rental?
It's that somebody will be living on site and that they perhaps will be serving a bagel. It's the bagel. Listen, it's the bagel.
Yeah, it,
Have a self-serve bagel. They can make waffles in a hotel.
I know now.
Bring your own bagel.
BYOB.
Don't we have
Bring
like
your own.
vacation rentals where people live there? We certainly do have short-term vacation rentals where the owner lives in the property.
and currently, if you give them a bagel in the morning, you're a bed and breakfast, and therefore you fall under certain rules, and so this is an effort,
If you say help yourself,
I don't know about that.
No, I think part of it is potentially advertising, marketing. I think bed and breakfast just sounds a little more, inviting. So I don't know if that has anything to do with the person thinking about, doing this at the Sunrise House in particular, but I do think, a lot of people, if they're looking at staying somewhere and they see bed and breakfast, they think a little nicer, more service than just renting out a room in a short-term rental.
Okay, so now that I have this, as I read this, is the new and improved way the zoning would read.
Yes, that would be,
My understanding is the ordinance should say, therefore, 4.4.222.6 shall be changed to read blah, 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 and that's it. Is that correct, Lori? Is that how this? So the therefore
okay,
needs to be completely reworded to just reference the part number and the new desired language. Which 0.5, 1/2 parking space for each room rented to guests shall be provided on site. And I do agree that on site and off street in essence mean the same thing, but we've gotta completely amend that, the therefore, to just say section 4.4.2.2, number 6, be amended to read.
okay.
So the root of it, is, and I was at the earlier planning board meetings, was we currently have a distinction between short-term rentals and short-term rentals with a bagel. And everybody universally agreed that that did not make sense, and that they should be the same. My recollection is that there was some division as whether we should make more restrictive the requirements on short-term rental, or less restrictive on if you have a bagel. And with what came before us, that would be my understanding of the way that it went, because it was a 6-0 vote. So, I hope that,
so maybe in your next new term here coming up on the planning board, you could work on making bed and breakfast less restrictive.
we could do that tonight. I think that would be a lovely idea.
I mean, even less than this. Because it doesn't really matter that it's on a corner, if you're requiring off-street parking.
Any other comment on the table? Go ahead and take a 7-minute break and back up council.